Well, this past church year, we learned a lot about our front lines, the places we are and the people we're with at any given moment, especially those who are non-Christians. And each and every one of us has a front line where we are called to be Christ's ambassadors wherever we go. The Apostle Paul wrote about that in his second letter to Corinth, and he said that Jesus commanded us to bring the message of reconciliation as if God were making his appeal through us. And this is why it's so important for us to be aware of the front lines and the people that God privileges us to meet every day. Now, for most of us, our front lines are fairly predictable. Family, home, friends, work, school, recreational activities, social activities. Those are the usual front lines that we find ourselves most often faced with. And they're most often very static. But at times our front lines are movable, as I found out this summer. Now, many of you are aware that in July, I traveled for 2.5 weeks in Europe with my dear friend, Pastor Sue Webster. And if any of you have ever seen that movie, if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. Have you seen that? I actually saw that right before I went on the trip. I was laughing. You will have some idea, if you've seen the movie, of what it's like to travel through 6 countries in about a week. Because every day is a new challenge. You have to adapt to a new country, new people, new traditions, and even new currencies. Because not everybody takes a euro over there, you know. You don't know that till you get there. And when you're on tour, you also have a busload of new people that you have to get to know in a week. And so our trip was, a whirlwind, and it had 3 parts, and there were 3 distinct front lines that God gave us for many front line moments. Well, even before the trip began, Sue and I prepared ourselves with prayer, and I know that there were many of you who were praying for us here and at her church in Holbrook. And I'll tell you, we felt your prayers before and during that trip. Because up until the night before we left, we weren't even sure we were going to be able to go, because my husband had broken his ankle 4 days before that. And the hospital, in their wisdom, wanted to send him home after they put these rods through his leg was like Frankenstein. He had rods sticking out everywhere, and they wanted to send him home because, he was not going to have the next surgery for a couple of weeks. And I said to the doctor, really, you're going to send him home in that condition? I said, what happens if he falls and breaks the other leg? Because that's what's going to happen. So he thought about it, and he thought, okay, well, we'll send him to rehab. So they sent him to rehab, and he was there until last Monday, actually. Now, my husband really felt badly about breaking his ankle, and so he said, I really want you to go on the trip. He said, I'm sorry this happened, but I don't want you to miss your trip. And it was a difficult decision for me to do that. But, I had also made a promise to my friend Sue that I'd go on the trip with her. And she had already planned this trip twice before, and it had fallen through. So, and she's 76, I think. She may not have gotten another chance to go on the trip, so I felt like I didn't want to see her disappointed. I think all those prayers really helped us to make the decision, number one, to have peace about it. And then while we were away, I wasn't worried at all. I just knew everything was fine. So the first part of our trip was 3 days that we spent in London in advance of the trip. Now, we're avid gardeners, both of us. Sue actually had her own business years ago, an herb selling business where she grew all her own herbs. So she wanted to go to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. I'd been there a couple times before, but I'd go there every week if I could. But it is the world's most extensive collection of plants and trees, and it has a beautiful, great big glass conservatory that was put in the Victorian times, and then a new one that was put in honor of Princess Diana. It has beautiful gardens and a huge arboretum with all kinds of rare trees. Now, the day we were there was kind of like this. It was overcast and chilly. I think it was barely 60 degrees. But, we were able to wander outside for a couple of hours, drinking in all of these beautifully planted beds. And the rose garden was in full bloom, and oh my gosh, it was huge. There was all kinds of different beds. And there was all these beautiful, intoxicating colors and lovely fragrances that were in the air. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that I even had a couple of these in my garden at home, so I felt pretty good. I had some ones at the Royal Garden, my little garden. Well, we got hungry, and because of the weather, there were very few people that were picnicking on the lawn that day. And so we went into the restaurant, and it was packed. There were no tables anywhere. And so I saw this table with just a gentleman sitting at it, and there were like 4 or 5 chairs, and I went over and I said, "Do you mind if we sit down?" And he invited us to sit. And a few minutes later, his wife came over and joined us. And they introduced themselves as Brian and Heather Spencer. And they had traveled down to Kew just for the day from their home in Cheshire. So what began as a polite conversation for dinner companions soon shifted to a much deeper level, as we discovered that we had many points of contact with this couple. Upon hearing that Heather grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, I was able to share with her my experiences of traveling there many years ago. And then Sue and I remarked on the fact that we're both English and Scottish ancestry, and both of them had relatives, believe it or not, in the areas that our people came from. And Brian happened to be a very keen gardener. And he was not only a keen gardener, but he was a proud proprietor of his own garden center, not surprisingly named Paradise Nurseries and Water Gardens. No, I say not surprisingly because they turned out to be Christians. So I think the Paradise was a double meaning. And they are very active in their local Anglican church. And Heather is a professional singer who is a mainstay in the choir, and she sings with sacred choral groups throughout England. And I told her about my daughter, who does the same thing here, stateside. And so as we talked, we made this very deep connection with them. And they made us feel at home, as if we were with relatives. And we felt this bond of the Holy Spirit between us, and after an hour or so, we were very sad to have to part. But Brian gave us his business card and sincerely hoped that we would visit them when we're able to. I still have that, so I got to go back now to England to visit Brian and Heather. And as the afternoon concluded, Sue and I reflected on this random meeting, which we saw as a gift from God. Because we no longer felt like strangers or outsiders visiting London. We felt at home. And we saw that we were Brian and Heather's front line that day. And they encouraged us in a way that only those who know the Lord are able. Now that was the Saturday, and the next day was Sunday. And I'll tell you, that Sunday was as near a perfect day as I've ever had in my whole life. It was truly a gift-wrapped present from God. In the morning, we worshiped at the Church of Holy Trinity, Brompton Road, where Reverend Nikki Gumbel is the pastor. And Nikki is the author of the Alpha program that's been used across the world, and it's brought millions of non-believers to Christ. And he's the most unassuming guy you'd ever met. I mean, he's not like Joel Osteen. I mean, you hear all the bad press that guy was getting this week. This guy is just, he's a guy you feel like you can just sit down and have a conversation with him. Wonderful preacher. And the worship is high energy and dynamic, and it's spirit-filled, and our spirits were lifted with joy, and we felt very much a part of that body of believers. After that service, we went next door to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we savored the sacred works of art from the medieval times, and they were all religious pieces, believe it or not. And then we were getting kind of hungry, so we walked down the street and we had tea in Harrod's garden room, which was wonderful. And we did a little bit of shopping in Harrod's. And then we hopped into a taxi. Oh boy, I feel like, I don't know who, Mary Tyler Moore or something. It was floating around London. But, it was a wonderful day. We hopped into this taxi and we made it to St. Paul's just in time for their evensong service that was sung by their world-famous cathedral choir. Oh my gosh. And at the end of the service, there was 3 of the young choristers who were graduating out because they were getting older, I guess, and they gave them an award, and it was just touching to be part of that service. And then afterwards, we enjoyed one of the 2 wonderful meals we had, because the food was pretty abysmal on the whole trip. Great meal in this little neighborhood restaurant near our hotel. And then we turned in for our 3:45 a.m. wake-up call. It wasn't the perfect day, I suppose.
Well, that was the next day.
Yeah, I know, but kind of curtailed. We didn't get to go up to have a swim in the pool or anything. We couldn't. We had time. So in the morning, we joined 51 other people on the tour, and we boarded the bus that would take us to Amsterdam. And so we traveled down through Kent, which is the southeast part of England. It's called the Garden of England, past rolling fields of hops and picturesque oast houses where they would dry the hops in the old days. And that's where my family came from, was from Kent. And then we boarded the ferry at Dover, and we watched the white cliffs recede in the distance, and in about an hour we disembarked at Calais, France. And then our bus wended its way through the coast of northern France, through Belgium into the Netherlands, arriving in Amsterdam just in time for a late afternoon cruise on their famous canals. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and it was a lovely day to do that. And that day we began to meet some of our fellow travelers. And in the evening we had a dinner in Amsterdam with two sisters, Nadia and Diana, who were from the Ukraine. And they were very excited to find out that Sue and I are pastors. Now, we didn't tell everybody we're pastors on this trip. I'll tell you, there's 51 people, you just, okay. Oh, by the way, I'm Pastor Susan and this is Pastor Sue. No, you don't do that. You wear your little name tag that says Susan on it. So anyway, we were having dinner with them, talking about our backgrounds, and they were really excited to find out that we were pastors. And they shared their enthusiasm with us for their churches. And Diana was very proud of her son, who was also a professional singer of sacred music. And the next day, Diana was walking on one of these uneven streets, and she sprained her ankle very badly. And so Nadia asked us if we would lay hands on her and pray for her. And so we prayed with them, and the next day, Diana's foot was healed. I mean, it was like, she said it was a miracle. So, okay, good. You're not going to be holding us up now for the rest of the trip. No, I mean, it was a touching moment. That's really why we prayed. You can't have these people straggling along. You should have heard the tour driver. He was a real piker. He was yelling at everybody. Come on, you're costing everybody time. Okay, no, but she did. She got a healing. And so as the tour went on, we made friends with two couples who were from Australia. Now, Australia is a big country, and they didn't know each other before the tour, because one couple was from way up near Darwin, and that's in the north side, the north end, and the other couple was from down near Melbourne in the extreme south, so it's a whole continent away. So it was Mike and Liz were from the north, and Julie and Andrew were from the south. Now, Liz mentioned that she and Mike are practicing Catholics, and they brought their sons up in the faith, and the whole family continues to attend church and celebrate holidays together, and they were telling us how special that was. And they were not real demonstrative about their faith, but it was clear that their beliefs were very much a part of who they are. Now, Andrew and Julie, on the other hand, were not believers. And even though their daughter was married to an Anglican clergyman, they still remained unconvinced. And they were respectful of our beliefs, however, but they made it clear that they were not interested in knowing more. Julie said she had no need for religion. And I assured her that even though Sue and I are pastors, we're not religious either. Really, we're not. Rather, we have a relationship with Jesus, and I explained the difference to her. Well, still, she was anxious to close the conversation, so we didn't press them.
Right.
Now, over the years, I've learned that readiness is very much a necessary condition for receiving the gospel. And it was clear that Julie particularly was not ready or receptive. And I pray that in time our Lord will bring others into her path when she is. Perhaps her son-in-law, maybe he's been shushed up a few times and has given up, but maybe God will bring someone else to her. Much of what we do in our front lines is seed planting. I think we have to always keep that in mind, because it's not done only with what we say, but it's also with what we do and how we are with people. We're not called to bring in a harvest. That's Jesus' work and his reward. We're called to merely be faithful followers when he gives us the opportunity and to plant a seed of the gospel in words and in actions. We had a wonderful time that week with these two couples, I have to say. They were wonderful, fun people to be with. And we took most of our lunches and dinners with them and enjoyed their company as we traveled through the Rhineland into Switzerland, arriving at Lucerne. And we stayed in this little town called Giswa, which is about a half hour outside the city. Too expensive to stay in Lucerne. And so we had this little hotel, and we had a casement window that looked out, and we opened the window, and it was like breathtaking, this scene. It was this quintessential Swiss postcard scene with the mountains and little chalets and little cows, grazing on the hillside. And on the rise just beyond the window stood a beautiful white church whose bells sang out the quarter, half, and hour times. And so late in the afternoon, as if we hadn't had enough walking, I mean, we were walking like 5 and 6 miles a day, just a lot for a couple of old dames like us. We decided we'd take a walk up the hill to the church. And so we were really surprised when we got there to find the door unlocked. And we entered, and we discovered that it was a miniature version of the great cathedral that we had visited in Lucerne that morning. It's an absolutely gorgeous church. And though it was empty of people, it was not empty of presence. We both felt that we were on holy ground. We were just standing there, just in the silence, and the outer door opens quietly. And in walks our traveling companion, Mike, from Australia. And we nodded to each other because words just did not seem appropriate. And so Mike walked up to the altar area and lit a candle and sat down in the front pew with his head bowed in prayer. Now Sue and I were praying in the back of the sanctuary. In the middle of this prayer, I felt this impulse from the Holy Spirit, and I was moved to begin singing the doxology. I know you would like this, Wendy. Wendy can love to sing the doxology. So I wasn't thinking of you. It was the Holy Spirit just brought this. I started singing the doxology, and then after a couple of notes, Sue joined in. And the sanctuary had near perfect acoustics, and our voices lifted high up and hit the ceiling and came back down, filling the space. And when we finished, we quietly departed, leaving Mike in the church. Well, later at dinner, Mike thanked us, and his eyes were filled with tears as he said he would never forget those moments in the church when we sang, causing the hair on the back of his neck to stand up as he felt the presence of God, like he had never felt before. And we said that we too strongly felt God's presence in that place, and we thanked him for sharing that with us. And that was in front of Andrew and Julie, by the way. Another seed, I guess, huh? Well, it was in Paris that God put Chantini in our path. She was a diminutive little Hindu woman from Myanmar in the southeast of Asia. Getting the flavor of this tour, people from all over the world on this tour. And she was traveling alone. She was a widow, and her children had paid for her to go on this trip. And I thought she was really courageous to go all the way from Myanmar by herself to London to pick up this trip. And there was a handful of travelers that wanted to visit the Louvre that morning. It was a busy Saturday at the museum. And she was visibly shaken at the prospect of going alone into this teeming mass of tourists. I mean, it was just a crush of people. I'd never seen such a crowd in my life. And so she attached herself to me and Sue, and we gladly welcomed her to join us. Well, I've been to the Louvre a couple times. If you've been there, you know what I mean. It's like, I didn't really care about going, but Sue wanted to go. I mean, this is Sue's trip, so, I just did what Sue wanted to do. So after seeing the obligatory Mona Lisa, which, is probably back where John Parkhurst is now, with all these people in front of it, And Sue had to see it, so I said, well, I'll just wait over here. And then the Winged Victory, which is at like the top of a staircase, so everybody can see that. We found ourselves in the Renaissance Gallery, which is mostly religious paintings again. And so Chantini began to ask us about Jesus. Out of the blue, she's asking us about Jesus, and she's asking about the paintings, and she's very childlike in a way. I mean, not that she was, she wasn't mentally, childlike, but she was a childlike person when it came to asking the questions. She was confused about the paintings because she thought they were real pictures of Jesus, like photographs. So, it was weird. But Sue, she began to use the paintings as a canvas to tell her about the gospel. And so using the paintings, she told her the Bible stories that were being depicted in these paintings. And Chantini was really open to hearing everything that we said. She was like this dry sponge that was thirsty for water, and she absorbed everything, and she began to tell us about her own background. Strangely enough, she was raised as a Hindu, but she attended a Christian primary school. And she talked about how lovely the nuns were and how sweet they were to her. She remembered their kindness. Her older brother became a Christian. He converted, and he became an Anglican minister. So she was open to Christianity and drawn to it, but she felt it would be disloyal to her deceased husband and her living parents to leave Hinduism behind. But she asked us many questions, which we answered to the best of our ability, and we urged her to find a Christian friend when she got home, maybe someone that her brother could introduce to her. And then we prayed with her. And later we prayed a lot for her, commending her to Christ, and knowing he's going to put somebody else in her path. It's just the one step you have to take, that's it. So after the tour, Sue and I enjoyed a couple of wonderful days in Paris on our own. And we were awestruck by the little jewel box of Saint-Chapelle, which is on the Ile de la Cité, right near Notre Dame. It's at the island that's in the middle of the Seine. And it has the most beautiful, I think probably the most beautiful stained glass windows in the world. It's a gorgeous little jewel box of a chapel. And then we stood in line for about an hour to get into Notre Dame. Again, I'd never seen anything like that before. I wonder whether the worshipers, I think they had a side door, you know. I think if we said we were going into a service, we probably could have gotten in, but you had to wait, and the line just kind of snaked around in the forecourt like this until you got up to the door. There wasn't really any worship going on in either church. They were like just tourist places. And then the next day, Sue's friend Roy and his wife Anne Sophie picked us up in their car and drove us to their idyllic home in the Belgian countryside. It took about, 5 hours, I guess, to get there. Well, about a decade earlier, Roy was an exchange student, and he stayed with Sue for a year at her home. So that's how we came to go and visit them. He was inviting her for many years. He wanted her to meet his wife and to see his children at his home. And this is why this trip was so important to her. She wanted to go and see where Roy lived. And they had a home that was a converted barn in rolling farmland. It looked like a Flemish painting. It was gorgeous. Belgium is very pretty, it really is. We visited the great cathedrals in Ghent and Bruges, and it is a strikingly beautiful country, but our impression was that it is a secular culture filled with glorious cathedrals and churches, which are practically now nothing but museums. I mean, there's just nothing going on there. It's really hard ground for the gospel. Now, Roy and Aunt Sophie are a young couple in their 30s, and they were very welcoming and charming. They introduced us to their family and friends. They had a big party one of the nights we were there. All the neighbors came. Lovely people. But it was clear that they not only didn't want to talk about faith, it was so completely foreign altogether that it was like, what? You know, they had no idea what we're talking about. And we noticed that in the area that they lived out in the countryside, there were all these little chapels. I mean, you drive down the road and there'd be a wayside chapel, and then another couple of miles down there's a chapel out in a field, and there's a whole network of little chapels. And Sue and I went down to the bottom of their road and looked at the little one that was there. And you can see it wasn't used very often. There were all kinds of cobwebs, and it was, pretty disused. But when we went to the party, we were asking people about it. These are people who lived there all their lives. Some of them, they had no idea what they were there for, who built them, or even what they were used for. No idea. And one day we were riding in the car with Aunt Sophie and Roy, and I don't know how it happened, but the subject of religion came up. I don't think we brought it up, they did. They observed that they were going to wait until their 3-year-old daughter was old enough to make her own mind up as to what she wanted to believe. And I couldn't help myself. I said, well, faith and worship are learned behaviors. I mean, your child's probably not going to do that because they need to learn, and the best way to learn is from their parents. Well, they said this isn't our job because in Belgium the schools expose children to all forms of religion and provide mentors to those who wish to pursue a religious belief. So again, this is like so foreign to them, it was not their job to do this. And so after that, there was no more discussion about religion. And we spent a pleasant 5 days in Belgium with this couple and their family. And it was apparent that Christianity was not only not important, it was non-existent. So our times of opening the conversation were met with either a bemused comment or ignored altogether, and the conversation turned in another direction. So sometimes the front line in front of us is not open to our invitation to the gospel. It's just not. And don't take it personally. These were lovely people. We enjoyed every minute with them. It's okay. Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2, you might remember. And he said, bring my message, and if it's not received, they should shake the dust off their feet and move on. We're not responsible for how people receive the gospel or whether we're successful in delivering the message, because success is not the object, you see. It isn't. Faithful following of Jesus is the object. And any success is his. Don't forget about that. We're not responsible either if people reject. It's not our failure. Success or failure, those are worldly things, aren't they? He's just asking about faith. All we need to do is to trust him. Now, it's said that travel broadens our horizons, and this certainly has proven true for me. I've traveled a lot in Europe over the years, but especially on this trip, I realized through meeting Brian and Heather and Mike and Liz and Nadia and Diana and Chantini, that Sue and I were not strangers or outsiders wandering in the world. But because of the kingdom of faith that is built by our Lord Jesus, we're always in our home country, wherever we are. And we find family there. That was the beautiful thing. Every day we were aware that God was going before us and preparing the way. And there were times of great blessing, and there were a few times when we were in great peril, and I won't get into that today. But we were safe, because underneath were God's everlasting arms, giving us refuge and strength. And though we may see our front lines as our opportunities to serve God by serving others, or maybe our obligations, if you want to use an even more negative word, what's happening is not really something about us serving. It's something much greater. It's not what we're doing that is most important. It's what God is doing in us. Because he's building us into a home where he is at home. Amen.
Amen.